Picking up off of the conversation we had on last week's show about Bray Wyatt, I did a further examination of him in a video that's up on PWF Empire titled The Bray Wyatt Paradox, a complex character in the simple world of wrestling. It's a pretty interesting video if I do say so myself. And now that I've got a chance to... See what I did there? Yeah.
Excellent.
Now that I've got a chance to see Bray Wyatt following that video, unfortunately some of the concerns that I raised in it are turning out to be true. I hate to say this, but I think his words have started to lose their magic. And the weird thing is, he's still just as talented now as he ever was, and his promos on their own are still entertaining. I actually liked how he played into the metaphors and he introduced the idea of a last man standing match with John Cena, waiting on John Cena to accept. Of course he's going to do that, but when they're viewed in a larger scope in an attempt to rate their impact, they fall short. For the first time while I was watching Raw, I found myself going, what the hell is he talking about? And it wasn't the kind of question that intrigued me. It was more of like, okay, get to the damn point. Because they feel supplemental now. I hear them and then wait to see them reflected in action, but it's not happening. Bray Wyatt, he loses, but then somehow he's still a winner. Just look at the promo he cut after WrestleMania. Then, on Raw, the Wyatt family loses, and all of a sudden, that loss causes him to have some type of friggin' epiphany, a revelation. Therefore, he sees it as a win in spite of the fact that he just lost. Cena, at the very least, he attempts to sell concern, but then he falls back on the same old hustle, loyalty, respect, like a fucking weeble. Remember that commercial, Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down?
Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down.
That's John Cena. That's John Cena.
You're right.
And what I'm about to say may piss some people off, but like I said, I'm going to go ahead and call a spade a spade. John Cena and Bray Wyatt, both characters are so damn stubborn that neither one of them could possibly be threatened for too long. That's the core issue here. They're both too busy trying to convince people that they're not bothered, that I don't even want to bother anymore. That's why I'm losing interest in the feud. I don't want to care because they're so impenetrable. They're so invincible that one person does something to the other, it bounces off, and then they're like, oh yeah, I'm still standing tall. And it kind of is like the flip side of the feud between the Shield and Evolution, because I look at the Shield and Evolution and shit happens to both of those teams and they have no choice but to stand tall, but they actually react to the things that happen. Look at what happened last week. Roman Reigns, he was left bloodied, coughing up blood in the middle of the ring, and they show up the next week on Raw like, you know what, you did that to us, but guess what, we're hunting your asses down, we're looking for you, we're not running from you, we want to run through you. They actually follow up to the things that happen and the things that are said. Unfortunately, John Cena and Bray Wyatt, they're not doing it.
Everybody always criticizes John Cena so much for being so emotionless, so unaffected by everything that happens in his feud, that no matter what, he's always coming back as the same individual. But can't the same be said about Bray Wyatt? And the idea of, if you beat me, why can I not stop smiling? That whole idea. How long before that gets stale? And it's getting stale right now, is that Bray Wyatt isn't affected by anything either. So I don't see how we don't also criticize him for that, because there's no real adjusting. There's just kind of this set story that just kind of stays on the set path, and it doesn't feel like natural. It doesn't feel as though there's anything really major happening. It just feels like we're kind of twiddling our thumbs until the next match, and that's the only real area where something important happens. Instead, we're just going to get the same I'm not affected, I'm still smiling, and never give up kind of promos that don't actually build to a match. They just kind of sit there and they just keep the guys the same. It's almost as if the feud is over. It's almost as if they're bouncing back from what happened in the feud, and they're not even still feuding.
They got a little gimmick match coming up, last man standing. That usually means the feud is coming to an end. I hope to God it ends. No matter who wins, nobody wins. This feud did not help anyone at all.
And it's very disappointing too, because it held such promise. it seemed as if it was a perfect matchup because we look for John Cena to have meaningful feuds, and Bray Wyatt was white hot going into the feud. Bray Wyatt, he had this amazing way of controlling the narrative, but I just think that this story, it doesn't work in wrestling. It just doesn't work. People like to call John Cena, you know, Super Cena. The dude is a fucking superhero. And Bray Wyatt is a super villain. If this was in a fucking comic book or something like that, I would probably love it. But it just doesn't work in wrestling.
And now you see my point.
Would you say it doesn't work, or would you just say it's been poorly executed in the past 2 weeks?
You can't tell this kind of story in a wrestling match.
See, David, on that point, I actually agree with you when you said you can't tell certain stories in wrestling. But that whole Undertaker thing, that wasn't one of the ones that you couldn't tell. I don't even want to put this in the same arena as this stuff going on with Bray Wyatt and John Cena. But Manny, to answer your question, was it like the story was wrong, or was it just poorly executed? I'm trying to wrap my brain around it because it's a very weird situation. Like, as I said in my video, people try to separate Bray Wyatt from the story as if he doesn't enable WWE to tell it in the way that they do. He's a complex character. Therefore, he can lose a match and then go out there and say something like, if I lost, why can't I stop smiling? And we all love him for that. He can go out there and he can beat John Cena and he can look weak in the process, but all he has to do is say, oh, I'm strong, I'm a god. That's the kind of person that Bray Wyatt is. So Bray Wyatt being who he is, it enabled WWE to execute the story in the way that they did. So
yeah, but see, they did it over and over. Like, they leaned way too heavily on that concept instead of actually giving us something to sink our teeth into. Like, nothing interesting has really happened in this feud since the cage match ended.
See, the thing I'll say about the story is that in a movie, in a superhero movie, in a comic book, when you end that book or that movie, that world, it comes to an end. And the problem with wrestling is that with the way this story is constructed, how do these guys move on to different feuds as the same people with everything they just went through? So that's how that kind of doesn't work, is that what you set up actually doesn't continue into the future, because you have to, the night after this finishes, set up something else for them, and you can't change their persona. That world doesn't end. Their characters continue, and you can't continue them as different people. When Bray Wyatt moves on to another feud and he starts doing all these promos on another person, how do you not look at that and say, well, John Cena, the world didn't come burning around John Cena. John Cena is perfectly fine. So how does this serve any sort of threat to this individual person if this didn't actually come true?
Well, I mean, at the same time, we did have years of The Undertaker talking about he was going to make people rest in peace and bury them and whatnot. But there were instances where he lost matches and had to move on to different feuds, and it worked then.
I don't think it's that similar.
Because, I mean, would we even be sitting here and saying this stuff if we had anything of interest that has happened in the past 2 weeks? Like, if something along the lines of what happened when Bray Wyatt brought out all the children and whatnot, the shock factor that we had, the culmination of interest, the progression from one part of the story to the next. If we had something like that in the past 2 weeks, this wouldn't even be a concern right now, and Bray would look like a shining star heading into Payback.
But can't you say this prolonged feud brought out those concerns rather than prolonging the feud as long as they have, or having this feud go this sort of length has brought out these kind of instances where we're getting a look into what could eventually be what Bray Wyatt is, and it's just somebody who's full of shit.
I don't think it's necessarily the length of the feud. I think that they just don't have the content to fulfill the length that they set out. So it is time to move on to something else, because they don't have anything else of substance to put into this feud anymore.
But the question we're asking here is, what happens when they go on to another feud? John Cena's still the same person, and Bray Wyatt goes and cuts a promo on somebody else, and that whole feud with John Cena turned out he was full of shit and couldn't actually come through. So how do you build him back up to be able to come through on these same cryptic promos and these same messages? How long before that just grows into a bunch of BS?
What happens is WWE creative fucked up and leaning too heavily on the idea that Bray Wyatt isn't affected by anything that John Cena does. That's what's ultimately led to these concerns. So if we get to Payback and come out of Payback and neither guy has changed at all, then the whole feud was pointless to begin with. They have to take something away from this feud, even if they move on away from each other. They have to take a piece of this feud that changes some part of them for it to be worthwhile.